I am Miller Files, and this is a case that has never left me, no matter how many years have passed or how many files I have sifted through since. Every detective has a story that lingers like a stain on the edge of consciousness, something you wish you could unsee, unknow, unremember. For me, that stain bears the name Richard Trenton Chase, known to the world as the Vampire of Sacramento. In the decades that followed, true crime enthusiasts would dissect his motives, journalists would sensationalize his crimes, and criminologists would attempt to map the labyrinth of his mind. But for those of us who have handled the raw files, the photographs, the taped interviews, the blood-stained reports, we understand that this case is not simply horrifying. It is haunting. It is a tragedy of a city, a system, and a shattered mind colliding at the exact wrong moment in time. To begin the first episode of this documentary investigation, we must return to Sacramento in the late 1970s, a place that, on the surface, radiated a uniquely American sense of suburban security. Neatly trimmed lawns, church bells on Sundays, families leaving bicycles on their front porches without a second thought, and parents who believed the worst thing that could happen on a quiet evening was running out of milk. Yet beneath that serene facade, cracks had begun to form, invisible to the naked eye, but deep enough for someone like Richard Chase to slip through. These cracks were not physical, but systemic. They existed in the medical institutions that failed to contain him, in the social networks that did not know how to help him, and most tragically, in the homes of victims who left their doors unlocked because they believed they lived in a neighborhood immune to evil. Richard Chase did not arrive in Sacramento as a monster. That word implies intention, design, purpose. But he did not possess any of those things. Instead, he was a young man born into a world he struggled to understand. His early years give us glimpses of the storm forming inside him, but they do not predict the scale of the destruction he would someday unleash. Childhood photographs show a boy with a shy smile, awkward posture, and a gaze that never quite meets the camera. Teachers described him as quiet, withdrawn, and anxious. Family members recalled strange behaviors that were dismissed as teenage oddities rather than early symptoms of a profound psychological disintegration. By the time Chase reached adulthood, the storm had fully broken. His delusions took root, and once they did, they grew uncontrollably. He believed his heart was shrinking. He believed his blood was evaporating. He believed that voices inside his skull were rearranging his bones, poisoning his organs, and slowly killing him from within. These are not the fantasies of a storyteller. They are the documented claims of a man whose grip on reality had dissolved into dust. And yet, he was eventually released from psychiatric care, deemed stable enough to function on his own. That decision, made without malice, but with catastrophic consequences, set into motion a series of events that would plunge Sacramento into terror. In December 1977, winter nights in Sacramento were quiet, the air crisp and the streets lit by the faint yellow glow of porch lights. The Griffin family lived in one such neighborhood, a peaceful street where tragedies seemed impossible. But on the evening of December 29, that illusion shattered. Ambrose Griffin, a kind, elderly man and father of two, stepped outside to help his wife carry groceries from the car. He never made it back inside. A single bullet pierced the night, struck him in the chest, and ended his life in an instant. Neighbors rushed out, terrified but confused. No one had seen the shooter clearly. At the time, investigators believed it might have been a random drive by the reckless act of teenagers misusing a firearm. No one imagined that it was the first strike of a predator wandering through their quiet streets. As we now know, Chase had driven through the neighborhood that night, firing at random. He did not know Ambrose. He did not choose him. For detectives like me, this randomness would later become one of the defining features of the case, and one of the reasons it was so difficult to solve. An offender who kills without motive, without pattern, and without planning leaves behind no breadcrumbs except chaos itself. This was the beginning of Sacramento's descent into fear. In the weeks following the Griffin shooting, Chase's delusions intensified. He became consumed by the belief that he was dying, that the only way to survive was to replenish his blood supply. His apartment, when later searched, would reveal the first clues of the horror that was brewing inside him: blood-stained containers, mutilated animals, and evidence that he had been drinking their blood. To him, this was medicine, a cure, a necessity. But soon, the animals were no longer enough. On January 23, 1978, Teresa Wallen returned home from a quick trip to the store. It was a typical afternoon, the kind where the world seemed harmless. She carried her bags inside and left the front door unlocked, a common habit in that neighborhood. That single detail, small and innocent, sealed her fate, because in Richard Chase's distorted worldview, an unlocked door meant he was allowed to enter. So he did, without hesitation, without awareness, without humanity. Inside, he encountered Teresa alone, pregnant, defenseless. What happened in that house that afternoon was so brutal that even the seasoned investigators, who later processed the scene, struggled to put their observations into words. The violence inflicted upon Teresa was not merely lethal. It was expressive, chaotic, and anchored in Chase's belief that her blood, her organs, her life force were the antidote to his imagined illness. This was the moment Sacramento realized it was facing something far more dangerous than a typical killer. This was not a man searching for money, revenge, or dominance. This was a man operating under the command of a delusion so powerful it rendered him unstoppable by logic or morality. Detectives scrambled to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. But before they could make significant progress, Chase struck again. Only 4 days later, on January 27, he entered the home of Evelyn Meredith. This time, the devastation was beyond comprehension. Evelyn was not alone. With her were her son Jason, her nephew David, and a visiting friend, Daniel Meredith. 4 lives intersecting in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. Chase murdered them with a frenzy that defied explanation. The scene he left behind was so gruesome that some investigators had to step outside for air. It was violence unbound by motive or structure. Pure chaos, pure terror, pure disintegration of the human psyche materializing in blood. The city of Sacramento went still. Doors that had once been left open were bolted shut. Parents escorted their children everywhere. Neighborhood watches sprang up overnight. People looked at one another differently, wondering if the killer lived next door, wondering if the next turn of the key might place them face to face with him. The randomness of his attacks made him impossible to predict, and unpredictability is the most terrifying weapon a killer can wield. For investigators, this case became a race against time. Every hour that passed felt like an hour borrowed from the future victims who had yet to be chosen. But then a break came. A young woman recognized Chase's face from a police sketch and revealed she had recently seen him acting strangely, covered in blood. This tip, combined with ballistic matches from the crime scenes, finally pointed us toward a suspect. On January 28, police surrounded Chase's apartment. What they found inside was a shrine to his delusions. Blood on the walls, blood on the floor, blood on the dishes, containers filled with remains that defied belief. It was a laboratory of madness, the physical manifestation of a mind completely untethered from reality. The arrest brought relief to a city suffocating under fear. But for those of us reviewing the evidence, that relief was fleeting, because we realized that the true horror of this case was not simply the killings themselves, but the fact that every step of the way warning signs had been ignored, minimized, or misunderstood. Richard Chase was not born a monster. He became one because the systems meant to protect both him and society failed catastrophically. This is the beginning of the Vampire of Sacramento story. The first cracks in the surface. The first descent into a darkness that would swallow 6 innocent lives and leave a permanent scar on the psyche of an entire city. In the next episode, we will explore more deeply the psychological unraveling that shaped Chase, the failures that allowed him to walk free, and the mounting terror that swept across Sacramento as detectives raced to stop him before he struck again. I am Miller Files, and as we step deeper into the psychology, history, and horrific unraveling of Richard Trenton Chase, we begin to understand that monsters are not always born. Sometimes society, circumstance, and untreated illness shape them into something unrecognizable. Episode 1 left us at the edge of fear that was beginning to swallow Sacramento whole. But to understand how the city reached that breaking point, we need to go back long before the first gunshot, long before Teresa Wallen's door was left unlocked, long before Evelyn Meredith's home became the scene of unspeakable carnage. We need to return to the origin of the storm. Richard Chase's descent into madness did not happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, like a slow-moving contagion that spread through his mind until reality no longer held any authority. His childhood was not marked by violence, nor by the typical signs associated with future killers. Instead, what we see is a portrait of isolation, fear, and psychological fragility. Richard was not violent as a child. He was frightened. Frightened of people, frightened of his own thoughts, frightened of a world that seemed hostile and unpredictable. Many would later claim that his father was strict, distant, or demanding. But strictness alone does not build a killer. What builds one is the mixing of fear with untreated mental illness, a combination far more dangerous than any weapon. By adolescence, Chase's behavior had shifted from shy to strange. He began to withdraw from friends. His grades dropped. He moved through life as if he were underwater, slow, detached, disoriented by currents only he could feel. Teachers reported that he rarely spoke. Neighbors recalled glimpses of him wandering alone, his movements jittery and his clothing mismatched. Nothing criminal, nothing violent, just a young man drifting further from the shores of reality. Then came the physical complaints. Chase insisted his stomach was rotting. He believed his blood was turning to powder. He told people his heart had stopped beating for hours at a time. Doctors conducted exams, found nothing wrong, and sent him home. But the absence of physical illness did not mean the absence of disease. His disease simply lived elsewhere, buried deep inside the labyrinth of his mind. By his early 20s, the delusions hardened into certainties. He was convinced that his internal organs were failing. He believed his body was collapsing inward, as if he were disintegrating from the inside out. When someone with a fractured psyche begins searching for answers, they often land on explanations that align with their delusions. And Richard Chase's delusion was that only blood could save him. Fresh blood, warm blood, the kind he believed contained the life force he was missing. Before he ever harmed a human being, he experimented on animals, cats, dogs, birds. He mutilated them, consumed their blood, and believed the act was medicinal. When neighbors reported missing pets, few suspected someone like Chase. He was quiet, thin, harmless in appearance, the kind of person you would never imagine capable of violence. And that assumption that evil always looks threatening is one of the most dangerous assumptions a community can make. Eventually, Chase's behavior escalated enough that he was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. This is where the story takes a darker turn, because for a time he received treatment. He was observed, he was monitored, but treatment alone does not guarantee recovery, and in Chase's case, the improvement was superficial. He learned to act calmer. He learned what to say to the doctors, and like so many patients with severe psychosis, he was released not because he was well, but because the system deemed him stable enough. Stable is a misleading word. It implies safety. It implies control. But in Chase's case, stability was an illusion held together by thin strands of medication and the fleeting structure of inpatient care. The moment he left that structure behind, his symptoms roared back with a vengeance. He stopped taking his medication. He isolated himself entirely. He turned his small apartment into a kind of laboratory of decay, lined with blood-stained utensils, animal remains, and newspapers covering the windows. The environment mirrored his mind, chaotic, dark, and collapsing inward. The tragedy is that people saw pieces of the truth. A roommate reported that Chase would walk around naked, smear blood on his face, and talk to himself for hours. Another witness mentioned that Chase believed someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. In any other context, such statements would lead to immediate intervention. But in the fragmented system of the time, intervention required paperwork, consent, and a threshold of danger that Chase always seemed to slip just beneath. He was sick, but not violent yet. He was delusional, but not criminal yet, and this yet would cost Sacramento 6 lives. Now imagine the city during this period. Families went about their routines, unaware that a man who believed he was dying, who believed blood was the only cure, who believed doors left unlocked were invitations from the universe, was wandering through neighborhoods. In his mind, he was not hunting, he was surviving. He was following a logic that made perfect sense to him, even if it was built entirely on delusion. This distinction matters because it reveals why his crimes were so chaotic, so disorganized, so impossible to predict. Chase did not plan. He reacted, and reactions cannot be profiled in the way calculated kills can. Before the murder of Teresa Wallen, law enforcement had no reason to look at Chase. There was no criminal record, no violent assault, no pattern of threats. He was a ghost drifting along the margins of society. Even when neighbors reported unusual behavior, the reports were vague. Strange, not criminal. Odd, not dangerous. In a city of 500,000 residents, a man behaving strangely was hardly grounds for investigation. But something was happening beneath the surface, something subtle but dangerously important. Chase was losing the last fragments of connection he had to reality. He rarely ate. He barely slept. He carried weapons because he believed people were after him. He believed Nazi UFOs were tracking his movements. He believed the government had injected him with poison. These delusions formed a network of paranoia that pushed him to act before being acted upon. And here is where we see the true tragedy, because if you ask anyone who encountered Chase during this period, they will tell you he was not intimidating. He was frail, almost skeletal. He looked like someone more likely to need help than to cause harm. But that illusion of fragility masked a far more dangerous truth. He was mentally collapsing in a way that removed all barriers to violence. It is not physical strength that makes a person dangerous. It is the absence of boundaries, the absence of fear, the absence of the internal voice that tells the rest of us no. Now let us shift to the atmosphere in Sacramento as these warning signs accumulated unnoticed. The city was not prepared for the horror that was about to descend. Sacramento was a place where children walked to school alone, where front doors stayed unlocked during the day, where neighbors borrowed sugar from each other and chatted over fences. In such an environment, the idea of a predator lurking among them felt absurd, and when a threat feels absurd, people ignore the early signals. By late 1977, residents began to notice missing pets. It was a trend that made headlines in the local paper, but was brushed off as the work of coyotes or pranksters. No one imagined that the missing animals were test subjects for a man feeding his delusions. Meanwhile, law enforcement received scattered reports about suspicious individuals wandering through neighborhoods, peering into windows, trying doorknobs. None of these reports named Chase. None of them described him clearly. But in hindsight, these encounters paint a chilling picture of a city being brushed by the fingertips of danger without realizing it. Then came the shooting of Ambrose Griffin, a single bullet that cracked open the illusion of safety. For the first time, Sacramento felt the breath of something sinister. But even then, the randomness of the attack made it difficult to connect to a broader threat. The case remained stagnant. No suspects, no leads, no motive. Just a grieving family and a community that hoped the incident was isolated. But Chase was escalating. His delusions were intensifying. He believed that someone or something was draining his blood, and he needed to fight back. He told acquaintances that he could feel his veins drying. He told others his bones were dissolving. The terror within him was real, and that internal terror fueled the external terror that Sacramento would soon experience. In the weeks before the murder of Teresa Wallen, Chase began testing the boundaries of his delusion. He attempted to break into several homes, but left when he found the doors locked. In his mind, a locked door meant rejection, a closed portal, but an unlocked door meant acceptance, permission, destiny. This belief would dictate the fate of his victims and the fear of an entire city. Now imagine Sacramento at this moment on the cusp of catastrophe without knowing it. Mothers preparing dinner, children riding bicycles, people jogging along tree-lined streets. In this peaceful picture, somewhere in the background, Richard Chase moved like a shadow, unnoticed but inching closer to the breaking point. In Episode 3, we will follow the timeline leading from the Griffin shooting to the first murder of Teresa Wallen. We will examine the hours, days, and decisions that brought Chase to her door, and how Sacramento's fear transformed into full-blown panic. I am Miller Files, and as we continue our descent into the darkest corridors of the Vampire of Sacramento case, Episode 3 brings us to the turning point. This is the moment when the storm that had been gathering around Richard Trenton Chase finally broke open. This is the episode where the invisible becomes violently visible, where the whispers of danger that Sacramento ignored suddenly erupt into a scream that the entire city could hear. To understand the murder of Teresa Wallen, we must first examine the days and hours that led up to it, because the events that unfolded were not spontaneous, but the result of a mind collapsing inward while a city looked the other way. After the killing of Ambrose Griffin on December 29, 1977, Sacramento remained uneasy, but not panicked. The shooting was tragic, but without witnesses or motive, it was chalked up to the unpredictable violence that occasionally punctures even the safest neighborhoods. No one connected it to a broader threat. No one imagined that the man responsible was already beginning the countdown to his next kill. But that countdown had, in fact, started the moment Chase fired his gun. For the next 3 weeks, Richard Chase moved through Sacramento like a phantom. He walked aimlessly, drifting between neighborhoods, following impulses rather than plans. His mind was deteriorating rapidly. He was not sleeping. He was barely eating. He believed that at any moment his organs would stop working. People who saw him described a skeletal man with hollow eyes, always muttering, always paranoid, always prepared for an attack that never came. The terror inside him was consuming him from the inside, and he responded by lashing out at the world, searching for what he believed would save him: blood. In early January, Chase began testing doors. It was as simple and horrifying as that. He wandered up to houses, tried the doorknobs, and if the door was locked, he moved on. In his delusional worldview, a locked door was the universe rejecting him, but an unlocked door meant he had been invited in. This distorted logic would dictate the trajectory of his violence. It was not about choosing victims. It was about choosing opportunity. And when opportunity presented itself, he walked straight into it. There were several reported incidents during this period in which residents saw a strange man lurking outside their homes. A mother with 2 children reported someone staring through her window at dusk. A retiree claimed someone tried to force open his back door, but fled when confronted. A college student found her mail scattered around her porch, as if someone had rummaged through it. At the time, these incidents seemed disconnected, irritating but not alarming. But when viewed through the chilling hindsight of the Chase case, they form a pattern. Richard Chase was circling the perimeter of his delusion, searching for a doorway into someone else's life. Inside his apartment, the environment deteriorated further. Investigators would later find newspapers covering the windows, blocking out the light. The blinds were closed at all hours. The floor was littered with trash, rotten food, empty cartons, and blood-stained containers. He had killed several animals during this time, mostly cats, and drank their blood. His obsession with blood had become his entire existence. He kept journals full of erratic scribbles, paranoid diagrams, and rambling explanations of conspiracies involving aliens, Nazis, and government agents. His mind was fracturing, and each fracture pushed him closer to violence. Then came January 23, 1978, a Monday, a day indistinguishable from any other in Sacramento. But for Richard Chase, it was the day his delusions collided with reality. That morning, he wandered through the neighborhood around Tioga Way. He carried a gun. He carried fear. He carried a belief that unless he found blood soon, he would die. He walked past several houses, testing doors. Most were locked. Most rejected him. But then he reached the home of Teresa and David Wallen. Teresa Wallen was 3 months pregnant. She was young, hopeful, and living a quiet suburban life. She had dreams of building a family, of raising her children in a safe neighborhood. On that January afternoon, she returned home from a quick errand, carrying grocery bags. She was unaware that danger was approaching her driveway in the form of a man who no longer recognized the boundary between life and death. She entered her home, set down her bags, and left the front door unlocked, a small detail, a harmless habit, a gesture of trust in her neighborhood. But for Chase, this was a sign. It meant he was allowed in, and so he walked through the open doorway and stepped into Teresa's home without hesitation. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying crime scenes in Sacramento's history. Based on the forensic reconstruction, Teresa was likely in the middle of her daily routine when Chase entered. She turned toward him. She may have said something. She may have had time to scream, but she did not have time to act. Chase shot her once, then twice more. She fell near the hallway. From that point forward, the crime scene descended into chaos, a chaotic reflection of the mind that created it. When I reviewed the crime scene photographs as part of this investigation, I felt a coldness settle into my bones. This was not calculated violence. It was frenzied, compulsive, and driven by a belief that blood was a medicinal necessity. Chase mutilated Teresa after killing her. He removed organs, he drank her blood. He performed actions that defied not only morality but comprehension. The attack was not sexual, nor was it rooted in revenge or hatred. It was the expression of a delusion that had consumed him completely. But what truly struck me when examining the scene was what Chase left behind. A house disturbed but not ransacked, valuables untouched, nothing stolen, no sign of an intruder who wanted money or items of value. Instead, there was the unmistakable signature of a disorganized killer, someone driven by impulse, not planning, a mind in free fall expressing itself in blood and chaos. The discovery of Teresa's body shook Sacramento in a way the Griffin shooting had not. This murder was intimate. It occurred inside a home. It targeted a pregnant woman. It bore marks of brutality that the public, once informed, could barely comprehend. Rumors spread quickly. Neighbors whispered. Newspapers printed ominous headlines about a possible ritualistic killer. Suddenly, a city that had prided itself on safety was confronted with the realization that danger was not coming from outside. It was already inside their neighborhoods. The day after Teresa's murder, Sacramento changed. Parents stopped letting their children play outside. Doors that had once remained unlocked were now sealed with multiple deadbolts. Sales of firearms, security systems, and guard dogs skyrocketed. Panic was no longer a whisper. It was a roar echoing across every street and neighborhood. And law enforcement felt it too. As investigators, we understood immediately that this was not a one-time event. The violence, the randomness, the disorganization, it all pointed to a killer who would strike again. And soon, but we still had no suspect, no clear fingerprints, no witnesses, no motive that made any sense. What we had was a crime scene so horrifying that it forced every detective to confront a terrifying truth. The person who committed this murder was operating in a dimension of mental chaos beyond anything we had dealt with before. Chase returned to his apartment after killing Teresa. He acted as though nothing unusual had happened. He sat in darkness. He drank from containers filled with blood. He continued believing that he had prevented his own death by stealing life. For him, it was not murder. It was survival. In the next episode, we will follow the detectives' investigation as they scramble to connect the Teresa Wallen murder to the Ambrose Griffin shooting. And as they begin to suspect, they are facing someone unlike any killer Sacramento has seen before. Episode 4 will take us into the final escalation of Chase's violence, culminating in the massacre at the Mireth home, a crime scene. So shocking that some officers never returned to field duty again. I am Miller Files, and as we cross into Episode 4 of the Vampire of Sacramento investigation, we reach the point where fear in the community transformed into panic, and where the investigation shifted from confusion to urgency. The murder of Teresa Wallen did not simply frighten Sacramento. It shattered the city's belief that danger could be understood, managed, or predicted. What confronted us after her death was something entirely outside the bounds of ordinary criminal behavior. We were not searching for a thief. We were not hunting a calculated serial predator in the traditional sense. We were confronting a man whose reality had already dissolved, whose world was ruled by delusion, and whose violence was not driven by desire, but by terror, his own internal terror, that he interpreted as a disease he needed to cure with blood. In the immediate aftermath of the Wallen murder, the Sacramento Sheriff's Department entered a state of controlled chaos. Detectives were pulled from ongoing cases. Crime scene analysts worked around the clock. Reporters gathered outside police headquarters, demanding answers we did not yet have. The brutality of the crime, the fact that Teresa was pregnant, the mutilation, the drinking of blood, these details formed a picture too horrific for the public and nearly as unbearable for investigators. But in the midst of that horror, one fact rang out with absolute clarity. This killer would not stop on his own. When I entered the Wallen home as part of the review team, something struck me immediately: the silence. A silence so thick, it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, unable to process what it had witnessed. Crime scenes often carry echoes: shattered glass, overturned furniture, signs of struggle. But this home was unnervingly still, as though the violence had drained even the air of movement. It was a place frozen in the last moment. Teresa had been alive, a place that would never be the same again. Investigators carefully documented each room. They traced blood patterns, analyzed bullet trajectories, collected biological samples, and every piece of evidence pointed not to a killer with a clear motive, but to a mind fractured beyond comprehension. The attack lacked planning. There were no efforts to hide evidence. The killer moved through the space erratically, acting not with precision, but with compulsion. This was not control, it was collapse. One detail stood out. There was no sign of forced entry. This told us something crucial. Either the killer was invited in, and this is what we later confirmed, the front door had been left unlocked. Combined with earlier reports from residents who had encountered a strange man testing their doors, we began to see a disturbing pattern. The killer did not choose victims. He chose opportunities, and those opportunities were defined by something as simple and as random as whether a door was locked. This was the moment when the investigative team first considered the possibility that the killer might be suffering from severe mental illness. The mutilation, the drinking of blood, the disorganized nature of the crime, all hallmarks of a psychotic offender acting under the influence of delusion. But even so, we had nothing resembling a suspect. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no clear leads, just a nameless force moving through Sacramento's neighborhoods with erratic unpredictability. Meanwhile, the public was descending into full-blown terror. Newspaper front pages printed phrases like sacrificial murder and ritualistic slaying. Talk shows speculated about cults. Some residents claimed they heard chanting in alleys at night. Others insisted the killer must be a trained butcher. Panic feeds on darkness, and Sacramento suddenly found itself drowning in shadows. People stopped walking alone, even in daylight. Men armed themselves with rifles. Women sat awake at night listening for footsteps. Every creak of a house settling was interpreted as an intruder. Every dog bark seemed like a warning. Every stranger became a suspect. Neighborhoods that had once been friendly transformed into watchtowers of suspicion. Through all of this, the investigative team began exploring a possible link between the Griffin shooting and the Wallen murder. Initially, the two crimes seemed incompatible. The Griffin case was a drive-by shooting with no intimate element, while the Wallen murder was a hands-on, frenzied attack. But two factors suggested a connection. First, both crimes used the same caliber of ammunition. Second, and more importantly, the randomness of victim selection indicated a disorganized offender, someone who did not follow a predictable pattern. We began combing through reports of suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to the Wallen murder. One report mentioned a thin, unkempt man buying a .22 caliber handgun. Another noted a strange individual walking through a neighborhood holding what appeared to be a weapon partially hidden under his coat. Each report alone seemed inconsequential, but taken together, they began to sketch the outline of a man spiraling into violent psychosis. As detectives traced these scattered leads, something else happened. People started calling in with stories of encounters that previously seemed too strange to report. A woman called to say a man covered in dirt and smelling of blood had tried to talk to her in a parking lot. A teenager reported that a man had stolen a dog from his backyard. A mail carrier said someone had followed him for several blocks, muttering about government conspiracies. These accounts seemed disjointed, but each added a piece to the growing portrait of the unknown killer. Despite these leads, we still lacked a name. But one thing had become clear: the killer was escalating. The Griffin shooting was impulsive. The Wallen murder was frenzied. And escalation, in cases like this, rarely stops until the offender is either captured or dead. This realization cast a heavy weight over the investigation. We knew that somewhere in Sacramento, a man was preparing knowingly or unknowingly to kill again. Inside his apartment, Richard Chase continued to lose his grip on reality. The delusions multiplied. He believed newspapers were sending him messages. He believed he was part of a cosmic battle between supernatural forces. He believed the only way to survive was to consume blood. He believed his enemies, imagined or otherwise, were surrounding him. He believed he needed to strike before they struck him. This paranoia pushed him into his final spiral. On January 26, just 3 days after the murder of Teresa Wallen, Chase made several attempts to enter homes. Doors were locked. The universe, in his mind, was rejecting him repeatedly. His frustration built with each failed attempt. Detectives later reconstructed his movements using eyewitness accounts, noting that he wandered for hours, sometimes disappearing into wooded areas, sometimes appearing suddenly in residential cul-de-sacs. He was searching for something, an opening, a moment, a door, a sign. In the evening, he visited a former acquaintance, a woman he had met years earlier. She remembered him as shy, awkward, but harmless. When she opened the door, she was confronted with a version of Chase she did not recognize, wild-eyed, filthy, trembling, and paranoid. He tried to force his way inside, but she managed to push him back and lock the door. After several minutes of ranting incoherently, he disappeared into the night. Had she not acted quickly, she might have become the next victim. By the morning of January 27, Chase was desperate. He had not consumed blood since the Wallen murder. His delusions convinced him he was dying. He carried his gun. He carried knives. He carried knives. He carried a belief that the world had become hostile and that he must take what he needed to survive. That afternoon, he reached the neighborhood of the Miroth family. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying events in Sacramento's history, a massacre so brutal that seasoned officers wept at the scene, some resigning from field duty altogether. Episode 5 will take us into that event, the final explosion of violence, the clues that finally identified the vampire of Sacramento, and the arrest that ended his reign of terror. I am Miller Files, and this is the final chapter of the Vampire of Sacramento investigation. Episode 5 is where the darkness reaches its absolute peak, but also where the truth finally emerges from beneath the layers of terror, confusion, and disbelief that had gripped the city. To understand how Sacramento brought the nightmare to an end, we must begin with the crime that broke even the most seasoned investigators, the massacre at the Miroth home on January 27, 1978. That afternoon began like any other in a quiet Sacramento neighborhood. Children played in nearby lawns, the winter sun hung pale in the sky, and families settled into their end-of-week routines. But inside the Miroth house, the final act of Richard Chase's violent spiral was about to unfold, and what happened there would change the trajectory of the investigation forever. Inside the home that day were 3 generations of life. Evelyn Miroth, 38 years old, was caring for her young son Jason and her 22-month-old nephew, David. With them was her friend, Daniel Meredith, who had stopped by to visit. None of them had any idea that a desperate man, delusional, exhausted, convinced he was dying, was wandering the streets outside searching for an unlocked door. According to neighbors, the quiet of the afternoon was broken by a series of sharp cracks, something they assumed were firecrackers or a car backfiring, but they were gunshots. Chase had found the front door unlocked, and in his mind, the universe had once again opened a doorway for him. He stepped inside. Daniel Meredith was the first to die. He was sitting in the front room when Chase encountered him. Chase shot him immediately, killing him on the spot. The chaos that followed was swift and merciless. Chase moved deeper into the house, encountering Evelyn next. She tried to flee, but she did not make it far. He shot her as well. Jason, her 6-year-old son, ran when he saw the gunfire. Chase caught him too. The child never had a chance. The brutality did not end with the shootings. What happened next crossed the line from murder to carnage. Chase mutilated Evelyn in ways that defied comprehension. He drank her blood. He mutilated Jason. And then he turned toward the smallest victim of all, baby David. When investigators later arrived, they were prepared for something terrible, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality. Baby David was missing from the home entirely. His absence created a silence inside the house that was almost supernatural, as if the air itself was holding the weight of something unspeakable. Search teams combed the yard. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, but the baby was nowhere to be found. It was only later, after Chase's arrest, that the truth emerged. He had taken the infant with him. What happened to baby David in the final hours of Chase's freedom remains one of the most haunting details of the case. His small body was later found behind a church, discarded like an object rather than a human life. Even among hardened homicide detectives, this discovery broke something inside us. There are moments in a career that leave permanent scars. This was one of them. The scene inside the Miroth home became the turning point. The magnitude of the violence, the randomness, the chaos, it pointed unmistakably to the same killer who had murdered Teresa Wallen. And now, for the first time, we had something resembling a lead. From Daniel Meredith's stolen vehicle, from footprints left in the snow of the backyard, and from forensic similarities between the two homes, a pattern began to emerge. But what investigators needed most came from an unexpected source. A woman who had once known Chase. Shortly after the media released a composite sketch based on several witness descriptions from nearby neighborhoods. A woman called the police. Her voice trembled as she explained that a man she knew, thin, sickly, mentally unstable, had shown up at her home, recently covered in dirt and behaving erratically. She had recognized aspects of the description. She had read about the killings, and she feared deeply that he could be involved. His name, she said, was Richard Trenton Chase. With that phone call, the investigation shifted from wandering in the dark to sprinting toward a target. Detectives pulled Chase's background. The pieces assembled themselves with terrifying clarity. History of mental illness, prior institutionalization, reports of animal mutilations, complaints from former roommates, statements about delusional beliefs involving blood. Everything pointed toward a man living on the edge of psychosis, ready to fall into violence at any moment. A team of deputies was sent to his apartment on Watt Avenue. When they approached the door, they noted an odor something between rot and metal. No lights on, windows covered. They knocked, no answer. But they could hear faint movement inside. Instinct told them that the man responsible for the city's terror was only a few feet away. When Chase finally opened the door, he attempted to flee. He ran directly into the arms of deputies waiting outside. He struggled, clawing and twisting like an animal trapped between fear and rage. But the officers overwhelmed him and placed him under arrest. With Chase secured, investigators entered the apartment. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay, blood, and filth. The floor was littered with newspapers and garbage. Dirty dishes were stacked everywhere, many stained with blood. On the counter, containers with coagulated blood sat open. Inside the refrigerator, investigators found body parts from animals. The walls bore smears that suggested someone had touched them with blood-covered hands. And most disturbing of all, they found a blender. Inside was a dark, viscous liquid that, when tested, contained traces of blood and organ tissue. This was not a kitchen. It was a laboratory of delusion. The evidence linking Chase to the murders was overwhelming. His gun matched the bullets recovered from both the Griffin and Wallen cases. His fingerprints matched those found inside the Miroth home. Blood samples from his apartment matched the victims, and his own statements, rambling, incoherent, paranoid, filled in the rest of the picture. When the case went to trial in 1979, the courtroom became a theater of conflicting realities. Chase sat silent through most of it, thin as a skeleton, eyes sunken, face expressionless. The prosecution argued that he was legally sane at the time of the murders, that despite his mental illness, he understood the nature of his actions. The defense insisted he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, so severe that he was incapable of distinguishing reality from delusion. The trial lasted months. Experts debated his diagnosis. Witnesses cried while recalling their encounters with him. Jurors listened to the forensic details with visible anguish. And in the end, the verdict came down, guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence, death in the gas chamber. Chase was transferred to San Quentin State Prison. But even there, his mind deteriorated further. He refused medication. He withdrew from other inmates. He believed guards were trying to poison him. He lived in a constant state of paranoia until December 26, 1980. When he was found dead in his cell from an overdose of medication he had been hoarding. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. And now, after all these years, what remains? What does a case like this mean? What does it teach us? From my perspective as Miller Files, the lesson is not merely about the horrors one man can commit. It is about the fractures in the systems meant to protect society. Chase was a man who needed help, deep, consistent, sustained psychiatric help, and because he did not receive it, 6 innocent people paid the ultimate price. The warning signs were there. The delusions were there. The animal killings, the hospitalizations, the obsession with blood, but none of it was enough to trigger action at the scale required. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Not every killer is born monstrous. Some are created through neglect of mental health, neglect of early intervention, neglect of the warning signs that seem insignificant until it is too late. In Chase's case, the tragedy was preventable, and that is perhaps the most haunting element of all. As I close this final episode, I return to the faces of the victims. Ambrose Griffin stepping outside to help his wife, Teresa Wallen coming home from the store, carrying bags she never had the chance to put away, Evelyn Miroth trying to protect her children, young Jason running in fear, baby David, the smallest and most defenseless of them all, and Daniel Meredith, who simply stopped by to visit a friend. Their lives ended because a system failed before their killer ever pulled the trigger. This is Miller Files, and this concludes the investigation into the vampire of Sacramento.